Namaskaram. My name is Ramya Harishankar. Dance Conversations. This iteration is a retrospective of Indian dance in Southern California, a digital documentation of conversations with colleagues, collaborators, mentors, and others who've enriched my life here, as well as the cultural landscape. I miss Jamuna Krishnan, a dear friend and colleague, but delighted to have her daughter, Ragini, here with us. Welcome, Ragini, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me here.
I'm so delighted to see your mother's picture right behind you, a beautiful picture of Jamuna, and I'm sure she's here in this conversation.
Yes. She wouldn't miss it for anything.
I know. We've had several conversations over the years. Yes. And I know your mom was a multifaceted personality. She was a dancer, a musician, a researcher, a scholar, a choreographer and teacher, yes. And also a professor at, yes. At the Delhi University, right?
Yes.
So I don't recall exactly when we met, but our mutual guru Kalanidhi Mami, I'm sure was the as you said, the common thread that brought us together, yes. At some point. And I'm sure there were several occasions in Chennai when Mami was celebrating her milestone birthdays and we all gathered. Yes. And I'm sure it was one of those, or possibly even before that.
Yes.
Then I remember the lovely 3 days we spent together. You were there as well.
Yes.
Your Jamuna and I, yes. in Chicago during the dance conference, yes. Enjoying the performances, presentations, and also having several conversations post-event.
Yes.
which was
the more exciting part.
Exactly, which was very interesting and exciting.
Yes.
And then, of course, before that. Actually, in 1995, your parents had presented my solo performance in Delhi after a long time,
yes.
Under the auspices of Kalangan, their organization. And what was extra special about that, other than the fact that I was performing in Delhi after a very long time, was that my first guru, Dakshinamoorthy sir, was present. Yes. And that was, very special for me.
Yes.
I was, thinking about it, I was meeting him after almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
So I know that your parents, every time they came to the US, they would call me from wherever they were. And if they were in LA, either they would come and visit us, or yes. we would go meet them up in LA. We never missed the opportunity to meet when yes. they were in LA. So what do you recall about all those different occasions?
So I think that you and Amma were like sort of soul sisters, with Mami being the common thread, Kanto Mami. And I think that what I can recollect is even in the early 80s, there are these pictures of Amma. I was just digging through some old albums the other day, and there was a lovely picture of hers with you in LA, and that's downtown LA, and you looking super hot, wearing these pants and a sleeveless top. And then there were lovely pictures at your home, where there was Sarla Mami, your mother-in-law, serving dinner, and there's Harish Anna. So I think that I grew up watching two friends, not just dancers, but friends who bonded so well, and every time you would meet physically, which may have been after a gap of a couple of years, but I think the threads of conversation of being on the same kind of wavelength was always there. You people would just start talking from exactly the same point where you left it. And I remember your visit to Delhi in '95 very warmly, because that was the time I got to know that you were also a disciple of my guru, Dakshinamoorthy sir. And yes, that performance with, under Kalangan of yours was extra special in many ways. And and of course, then later on, when we visited Chicago for the dance conference, and those 3 days that we spent together, Amma, you and I, were an absolute riot. More than, as I said, watching the performances, soaking in the ambience of the conference, were those very special, very often dance related and very often not so dance related topics that we would discuss over lunch, over dinner. So I would always sense, and I was enveloped when you and Amma would talk of this very warm kind of a camaraderie between, as I said, two dancers who had so much to talk, so much to share. And you were always, both of you, as I said, you were always on the same wavelength. There was a similar kind of a thinking. There were similar opinions on dance. There were similar opinions on life. I remember Amma and in fact Kantu Mami saying that both of you had husbands who were very supportive of their wives' dance career. So that was another common thread between both of you. And my Appa, knew your father so well because, as Bliss and Cotton Nagarajan in Delhi. So even the two families, there was so much, as I said, common. And there was a great friendship between you and Amma.
So when I started teaching here in the US in the early 80s, it was always having come from such a strong lineage, like Mami and Vadyar. It was very important for me that my students have a good, solid, complete dance education, and whatever I could give them, I wanted to make sure that I could give to the best of my ability and give them experiences that I've had and also experiences that I did not have, for whatever reason. So when Mami came with a bunch of her students, Kalanidhi Mami, in 1989, we started Arpana Foundation, like Kalangan, to bring dancers and of every form, not just Bharata Natyam, to Southern California, because it was not happening at that time. And with regard to workshops, I always wanted them to have workshops which would in some way expand their horizon and expand their understanding and appreciation of Bharatanatyam, right? And myself, having grown up in Delhi, and Hindi was almost like my mother tongue, even though it wasn't. And I was very fond of Hindustani music as well. And so when I came to know that your mother had done research and developed a whole repertoire of compositions to be added to the Bharatanatyam repertoire, I was very keen that you come and share that with my students. And my students were also quite cosmopolitan, coming from different parts of the country. So I had invited you and Jamuna to come, and you came and spent 2 weeks with me. And also you've done workshops in other places, perhaps, right? So I just wanted you to share, also because you teach in Delhi, not in the heart of Tamil Nadu or Madras, the challenges as well as the pros and cons of teaching not necessarily in the home of Bharatanatyam, but in the diaspora.
So that was another point where I think that you and Amma had very similar approaches, because while your training was very strict under Vadyars, under gurus, but after marriage, of course, you moved off to the United States, and Amma always was training and was living in New Delhi, far away, as you said, from the seat of Bharatanatyam, which is Tamil Nadu. And so one is that the audience for whom you perform is very different. It's cosmopolitan. It's, let's use the word, uninitiated, both in terms of culture as well as in terms of understanding and the sensibilities. And also your teaching target, the target audience for whom you were teaching, was a very, very varied kind of a blend. And the pedagogy which I saw and which Amma spoke about, the way you had developed in Southern California, while sticking and remaining very true to the tradition that you, of course, inherited from your gurus, but tweaking it, changing it very gradually, trying to suit the sensibility of maybe first-time learners and very many second-generation Americans, was something that Amma was also doing kilometers away, across the seven seas right here in Delhi, because we were also removed from Chennai, and students or families who were getting involved, wanting their children to learn Bharatanatyam, were completely uninitiated or into the ethos, into the background, and sometimes even into the mythology of the dance that we so often take for granted. And it's something that, we as South Indians have grown up with. So while a Chidambaram, a Sri Rangam, a Sri Villiputtur, a Tirupati remains very alien to them, they could relate very easily to a Mathura or a Vrindavan or a Rajasthan or a Meera, or for that matter Ram in Ayodhya, far better than say Vishnu in Tirupati. So keeping that in mind, when Amma got into researching the works of North Indian poetry, poets, it was not, as I said, I don't think of it now as a very premeditated exercise that, okay, I have to research poets of the North in order to teach students coming from the Northern Belt. I think it was the reverse. Her foray began into North Indian poetry, and it so happened that when students came, she felt that instead of teaching maybe, say, a Shabdam like Sarasi Jakshulu, which has, say, lyrics in Telugu, which they cannot understand, it was it was making more sense to give them the same Shabdam format, but using, say, the lyrics of Surdas ji. So if you would say, Dhaniye Brindavane ki Renu, they understand it much better than a Sarasi Jakshilo, even though they may not understand in that sense what is Braj Bhasha. But the very word Brindavane ki Renu, it is very relatable to them. So this was something that I when we had the workshop with you in 2011, we were very happily introduced to a bunch of students who were not only very well trained in the technique of Bharatanatyam, but who were also very well informed. Now, obviously, students sitting right up there in LA may not have had any kind of a direct initiation into Hindi or Brij Bhasha or Awadhi. But when you started, like when Amma started teaching the pieces, they knew the background, they knew the leelas, they knew the mythology, they knew the story, which would not have been possible had you not sort of initiated that process of keeping them within the traditions of the dance, and yet, of course, as I said, always bringing in that element of newness, of freshness, to make the dance have more value to their lives, and also to have more meaning. Why are they doing it? So that answer to why was in the way that you had sort of re-looked at the traditional way of teaching Bharatanatyam.
रहती
श्याम सुंदर तुम काहे दुख पावती मोह पर पावती हो होली पुनि कछु काहुनी बदरावती मैं अपने बल रहती श्याम सुंदर तुम काहे दुख पावती
I think, what happens is that in the diaspora, it's very interesting, is that there's one group of parents who look at Bharatanatyam as a way to introduce their children to their heritage and to their roots. And they're very conservative, And then there is a group of people who are looking at Hema Malini and Vaijanti Mala and think, oh my God, that's glamorous. And they were all these great dancers who were trained in Bharatanatyam. So that is what is the attraction to Bharatanatyam for them. And particularly in the last 20 years with the growing popularity of Bollywood, dance. So there is always this tug, between conservative thinkers and those that are, so I always try to move them to the center and say, we were very fortunate to have gurus, which we didn't realize. And as I think more and more, I realize how open-minded they were, to allow us to explore Mami and in my Vadya too, so to move the more conservative to say, hey, we could do something which is not necessarily based on Rama and Sita or mythology, and tell the people who are more, leaning towards Bollywood that, this is a good discipline. Bollywood you can do at any point in your life, but if you don't have the foundation of a good classical tradition, it's all going to crumble and fall at some point, So try to keep moving them to the center, and that's a task. Probably it happens in Delhi too,
Oh, yes. So I do recall that when we did the workshop with you also, there were some of your senior students who were experimenting with, contemporary movement, with movements in dance. And yet, so that was, of course, their, the academic sensibility sort of veered them in that direction. But in terms of their training, the body was grounded in the classical. There was that kind of, as you said, a discipline which you had sort of inculcated in them, which made that workshop very, very dynamic. It made it very exciting because we were not just teaching a bunch of students where we had to literally tell them who Rama is, who Krishna is. And at the same time, when these oft looked at gods and goddesses were treated differently by the North Indian poets, the students were very open to that kind of a interpretation and that kind of learning. So I think that's possible only when they have been, number one, when they've been exposed to the traditional, and at the same time they've also been exposed to that freedom of allowing themselves to move and grow using dance as a tool, but of course moving in their own chosen paths. And that was exactly what I think Amma also, that was a challenge which she also grappled with during her initial years of teaching, because the road to expecting your audience to understand and welcome this change of introducing North Indian poetry into the grammar of Bharatanatyam was not easy. It was initially a very rocky road because a lot of her, critiques, they said that when you already have a storehouse of compositions and poetic works used in traditional Bharatanatyam, what was the pressing need to sort of move into North Indian poetry, and why use that for Bharatanatyam? But there was this wonderful parallel and a kind of a great connection that she saw in terms of poetry, and I always found that in your dance, where you reflected on poetry. For you, the
Absolutely.
poetic impulse of a piece was what was the catalyst for choreography. That was what sort of gave you the
Yeah,
idea how to move, whether to include movement, whether to keep it as a pure Abhinaya piece. This just brings
absolutely.
me to last year's that performance which you and Amma did together at the Atelier. And you took up a piece
Yeah.
which was, not often, I mean, it was not the regular Padam Javali kind of a piece, and you're taken
Film
up
song. It
classical
was a
film
film
songs.
song.
Yeah, and then to do Abhinaya on that. Now, that I would say was something where you use your traditional training, but you're using it for a new vocabulary. So that
Yeah.
was exciting. Yeah.
I'm glad I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think
Yeah.
Bharatanatyam, of all the forms, I know I might be
Yeah.
biased, but is so all encompassing and
Yes.
embraces
Yes.
everything. And I really look upon it as a language with
Oh,
which you
yes.
can interpret anything, whether it's
Yes.
English or Hindi or French. I mean, of
Oh,
course,
yes.
the musical aspect has to be taken into consideration, but
Yes.
generally I mean, what does it matter if you add more compositions? The more the
Yeah.
better.
Oh, yes. Oh,
um,
yes.
and again, like I said, if the poetry is beautiful, why
Yeah.
not?
Yes. Yes. So there again, even
So
in your works,
so
the
going
poetry
back
has
to,
been the catalyst. So I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I think this is something we were all initiated into by Mami.
Yeah, absolutely.
The sensibility to the music, sensibility to
Yes.
the poetry, and
Yes.
it's something that I emphasize with my students. Right, you have to connect
Yes.
and make it your own.
Yes.
Whatever poetry you take, you should connect from your heart and your
Very true.
spirit, and then
Yes.
only
Yes.
then can you do abhinayam.
Yes.
So
Yes.
when did your mother start learning? When did Jamuna start learning Bharatanatyam, and where in Delhi?
Yes, she was a Delhi girl and had her education in Delhi, and was a very late entrant into the field of Bharatanatyam, because initially she was trained in Carnatic music. Her grandmother, that is her mother, that is my maternal grandmother, being a concert, vocal, and a veena artist. And although Amma was very fond of dancing and at several points of time, expressed this desire to learn, but as often in most of the Brahmin households, the idea was put down by my grandmother, who said that do whatever you want once you get married. And they always felt that the life of a dancer was very short, whereas as a concert vocalist, you could sing right into your 60s or 70s. So she used to tell me that when she got married to Appa, and my older sister was born. So Rohini was 2 years old when she suddenly expressed this desire to Appa to start learning Bharatanatyam, and he supported it, thinking that it was just one of her passing fancies, that this would just wear off after some time, because Amma would love to indulge in a whole lot of things, whether it was embroidery or stitching or knitting, or whether it was, women's movements or whatever. So she went to Triveni Kala Sangam, which was the closest to my grandmother's house, right there in the heart of the city in Todarmal Road.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Guru Govindarajan was taking a class. Now, she didn't even know who the teacher there was. So she went up to the reception and found out as to who is teaching. And Mama was taking a class up there. And so she waited, and Rohini was a 2-year-old accompanying my mother. And Mama came down, and so she said, dance classes. I want dance classes. So he, obviously, the first thought that went into Vadyar's mind was that the class was meant for the child. So he immediately looked at Rohini and said, no, too small,
Too
not
young.
possible. So she said, no, it's not meant for her. It's meant for me.
It's
So,
for me.
those were the days when dancers, had some training either in the south or in another part of India. And after marriage, they would come and settle down in Delhi. So he thought that Amma was one of those. So he said, I don't have time to revise all old items and all. No time. Because he was a very busy Nattuvana, doing Nattuvangam in those days for Indrani Rahman, for Sonal Ji, for Yamini Akka. So she said, items. I don't know any items. I start from beginning. So he again thought that, what will somebody who's 25 do? It might be just something that will last for a couple of months and will just fizzle off. But I think such was Amma's passion that in spite of having a full-time job as a professor in the university, yeah, those were the days when there were no full-time maids. You had to do the cooking yourself and bringing up a toddler. Yeah, so with these kinds of challenges, I think the path of learning was something that was completely fueled by passion. So Amma used to tell me later on that never in her wildest dreams did she ever think that she would do an arangetram. Never did she ever think that she would perform. But it just happened so organically, even with her teacher, who turned composer for the first time when Amma, decided to do an arangetram. So that was the first time when he composed the Jatiswaram, he composed the Varanam, he composed the Tilana. So Mama turned a composer when Amma, did her arangetram.
Had her arangetram.
Yeah, so that was, and after that I've always seen that her learning or her the process was extremely, extremely organic.
This is a question I want to ask, especially of daughters of dancers, because I know sometimes the children don't want to follow in the footsteps of their parents, and sometimes they do, it varies. So how was it with you?
No, I think for me, it was just that, I started dancing even before I walked. So it was something that came very naturally to me. And the home was always reverberating with music and dance, because Govindarajan sir would come home thrice a week, and our music guru Gopalakrishnan Mama would also visit us thrice a week. So the only day that was sort of where, which was sort of free, where there were no gurus, was a Sunday. So I remember very, very early childhood memories being with these gurus, seeing them take class like one-on-one for Amma. And I have even pictures, so there's photographic evidence of me as a, 1.5, 2-year-old sitting on Govindarajan sir's lap, and he's like got me on his lap and he's conducting Amma's class. So I think that these memories, these inputs in my initial dance learning were extremely precious. And when I was about 4,
absolutely.
Yeah, when I was about 4, then Amma felt that the formal training in dance should start. And while initially she did teach me for about a year alone, but after that she put me under Govindarajan sir also. So I was about 5.5 when I started training with him. And later on also, right till his demise, I was with him. When he passed away in 1994, she never felt that just the mother grooming the daughter was enough, even though, of course, I had been learning for almost more than about 13 to 14 years. But she never felt that the process of learning should stop. And that was when Dakshinamoorthy Sir came into my life in 94. So it was as later as 94 that I started training with him. And after that, I trained with Usha Srinivasan, then went to Mami. And Mami, I remember the first time when I went to Mami, the first thing that Kantu Mami said was, why do you want to... So Amma would always say, no, she has to learn that rigor, that tutelage, that technique from you. So Mami would say, but you're doing the same technique. So Amma would say, no, it's not the same as learning from you, which I think was so true. Yeah.
Govindarajan sir was the same Tanjore style.
Yes. He was a disciple of Sikil Ramaswamy Pillai. So they were actually from that Pichaya Pillai school of Tanjore. And but Ramaswamy Pillai came to Delhi way back in the 50s, and Govindarajan sir had accompanied him at that time as his protege. Assisting him in classes, assisting him in Nattuvangam. And Mama was an amazing singer. So even when he was in the South, He was trained in singing Tiruvarulpa, singing the devotional hymns. And when he would sing the padams, when he would sing the arulpas, when he would sing the viritams, there was, I mean, his music was all emotion. So the dance just happened so, as I said, so organically. And I remember as young students, we never really had to bother about rehearsals or orchestra or, giving this script to the musician or, number of times, because it was always Mama singing for Amma's abhinay. And it was happening in the class. So for her, it was the dance, the creation, the making of an item was something that happened in every class. It was not something that was geared up for a performance. So that was very exciting.
The learning in those days is a very different experience than today. Yeah,
totally.
And even we cannot. We are not Arvadyars, and we cannot teach that way anymore. Unfortunately.
Yes.
So as we mentioned before, your parents had Kalangan. When was it started, Ragini?
So Kalangan was officially registered in 1992, although we started it in 1991. And very interestingly, the organization, the brain child was Amma, of course, and ably supported by Appa. The idea of starting Kalangan was primarily only as a chamber organization for music. And because my sister was wheelchair bound and couldn't move and go to concerts, I mean, in those days, the venues were limited. They were not wheelchair friendly. You couldn't move the wheelchairs into auditoriums. It's very different now. But way back in the early 90s, that was the kind of situation. And they felt if she cannot move out into the auditorium to listen, then why not try to see if these greats could be, brought into our homes. And I think the support, the infrastructure, the government support for the arts was so strong in those days, because I remember great musicians like Shankar Narayanan sir, Sheshagopalan sir, Sikil sisters, O.S. Tyagarajan sir, Maharajapuram Santanam sir, traveling from Chennai to Delhi by train. And when they would perform for Kalangan as chamber, either the AIR or the Doordarshan would organize a recording of the artists. So they were all A grade or A top artists. So it made, economic sense to come all the way from Chennai to Delhi for a chamber performance. And I think those were, Ramya, those years I don't think they'll ever come back. There was such a funny incident, because I remember that we would double up as everything, as organizers, as media people, publicity guys, doing the works. And, Appa would handwrite every letter to the artist asking for photographs, for publicity. And the hard copy would be sent to the newspaper for putting in coming this week, or for giving it to their critics. And there was this real funny incident, because the concerts would actually go house full. They were non-ticketed. And so Appa would always keep a bag of his on the front row, just to sort of reserve a seat either for himself or to see that an important older person or a guru who comes in could be given. Could be given. So he was standing on the wings, on the aisle, trying to manage the crowd, when there was this gentleman who came pushing everyone in a great tearing hurry and wanted to make his way right to the front. And, there were people sitting on the floor. I think it was for Sheshagopalan sir's concert, where he sang for, I think, the 3rd or the 4th annual day of Kalangan. And there were people jam-packed on the floor in Triveni. And there was this gentleman moving forward, and Appa was like, sir, please, that seat is reserved. So he immediately said, do you know who I am? I'm a very good friend of Mr. Krishnan of Kalangan. So Appa was like, oh, Mr. Krishnan, please go and sit. So I always feel that now that since we are in such a, what do I say? Everything now I feel is just so orchestrated. It's just so
Yeah.
planned. It's sometimes near perfect. So you don't have really that element of spontaneity, that element of
Yeah.
that old world charm is not there.
Times
Yeah,
change,
yeah,
everything changes.
yeah.
We kind of touched upon it already about your mother's legacy is the
Yes,
Raj repertoire of Hindi poetry
yes,
that she has added to the to Bharatanatyam,
yes,
which she also tuned and choreographed,
yes,
not just picked or
yes,
researched on them. And you also mentioned about the performance that we did last in
oh yeah,
2019, and Sandhya had invited me to
yes,
perform at her studio, and I had said Kalanidhi Mami's birthday just went by,
yes,
so if you don't mind, I'd like to do it as an offering to Mami.
yes,
And then she said, oh, can I ask Jamuna auntie to dance as well, because she's also Kalanidhi Mami's student? And I
yes,
said, of course, it'll be
yeah,
great for us to do it together. So that's how we ended up that evening.
yes,
And she did give quite an extensive I'm talking about your mother Jamuna, gave an extensive introduction to her work, to her research, and all of that. So when did she start the research?
Her first foray into research was into the poetry of Vidyapati, and that was way
Yeah.
back in 1982. So she started
Okay.
researching
Oh,
into,
that far
yeah,
back.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, Vidyapati happened completely by chance. It was
Yeah.
Krantu Mami and Rohini Bhateji who were working on a joint collaborative project. I think it was sponsored by either the Ministry of Culture or Sangeet Natak Academy. It was a performance grant where they had to work on the interpretation of Nayikas in their respective styles. And Amma had at that time, she was visiting Kantu Mami for one of her learning sessions. And in that Shastri Nagar Mami's house, Kantu Mami and Rohini Bhattiji were talking and ideating about how to go about the performance. And Rohini ji, said that you people are so lucky in Bharatanatyam. You have these absolute gems of padams, javalis, into which you can just sort of dive in and pick out these treasures. And we have a kind of paucity of that kind of literature. So Amma at that time was reading Vidyapati, which had been sort of given to her by a colleague from the Hindi department in the Delhi University. A book was handed over to her. So Amma immediately, later on she said in complete naivety, she said that, Rohini ji, there is this beautiful piece which can maybe serve as a contrast to what Mami was doing. And Rohini ji was very gracious enough to take that piece, tune it to music, and finally it was performed in Delhi at the Kamani. And so a lot of people told Rohini ji that I believe the highlight of that evening was that piece on Vidyapati that you took up. And Vidyapati at that time was like, I won't even say it was like Mandarin to us, because Mandarin is like the most spoken language in the world. So it was completely unheard of. Nobody had heard of Vidyapati. And more importantly, the language in which he wrote, which was Maithili, was very different from Surdas's language, which was Brij Bhasha, very close to Hindi. And Maithili was spoken in the eastern part of India, which was in Bihar. So Amma always told me, she said that whole night she couldn't sleep. It was like a kind of a shot in the head that had gone in. And she kept feeling that if this could be done in Kathak, then why can't I go deeper into the poetry, go deeper into his works? And it was very strange, Akka, because Amma came from a very typical Iyer household where, of course, nobody was speaking, leave alone researching or conversing in Hindi. But her colleagues, her friends, and of course, growing up in cosmopolitan Punjabi Delhi led her to being very comfortable with Hindi. And even when even when she taught economics in the Delhi University, the very first year, she opted to teach it in Hindi for the first generation learners. So, so the first project was Vidyapati. And what was very special, as was the case with her later works, was that it was never one odd piece that was taken up just for the sake of performance, but the entire Padavali, the entire work of the poet was researched. It was what do I say? She contemplated on it and then picked up pieces which she thought would suit performance, which could be sort of interpreted in Abhinaya or in Nritta, because she even composed a Varnamalika very similar on the lines of, say, a traditional Tanjavur quartet Varnamalika, which brings me to, again, yesterday when I was scrolling through FB, I saw that wonderful Pushpanjali which you did, Vadyar's composition, which I'm sure you have reinvented it over time without sort of robbing the piece of its beauty. And yet there was so much stillness, there was so much calmness, and stillness can sometimes be deceptive, So even though sometimes we think that Abhinaya, nothing much is happening because the dancer is just sort of still, she's not moving much. But I think the kinetics in Abhinaya is so much more than Nritta. Nritta is spent energy, but Abhinaya is completely, it's energy that you consume, that you conserve, and which ultimately sort of consumes you. So Amma would always say it's much easier to do a Tilana than do a Kshatriya Padam, because you're just so dead at the end of it.
Absolutely. And always I tell my students, they think, let's do Abhinaya because they don't have to sit in Aramandi. I said, no. The way I teach Abhinaya is very, very hard. Aramandi is easier.
Yeah. And then, of course, after Vidyapati, she went on to Surdas and did about 4 projects into each project researching and showcasing a unique element of Surdas's poetry. So one was Epiphany in Sur's poetry. That was her first, which was very interesting, which had revelations of the Godhead being made through the eyes of the poet. So the mother, Yashoda, is unaware, but the audience and the poet knows that the child is the creator. Very similar to what you have in,
Ramo Nama
Babua, or for that matter in, Jagadodharana. And then the next was, project was Radha Krishna, which spoke about this very dynamic, intense, yet a very fun relationship between Radha and Krishna. So we had 4 sets of dancers and each were a pair, like the Radha would ask a question and the Krishna would give a kind of a repartee. So she had chosen poems that were capable of handling that kind of complexity in that relationship. And the last part of her, there was one more, which was Vedugana, which was very interesting, where the flute of Krishna was personified. So the flute became the Naika, talking to the gopis, and the gopis were, retaliating back as to why are you so close to Krishna? And the flute gives,
very, very
answers
sweet.
to that, And, the one of the pieces that we did at the workshop, which was Karinyari, was taken from that Radha Krishna project, where young Radha sort of gives a very angry, befitting reply to Krishna, and she says, take away your cows. So she's obviously very young. As I said, exploring the dynamics of Krishna over the years. And the last of her projects for Surdas was a very special project. I think that remained the closest to her heart, was Brahmargi, which talks about Krishna, already the king of Mathura, and when Udho, his messenger, goes to tell the gopis that give up your worldly kind of love for Krishna that you have. It's only you have to think about Krishna as your Jivatma, and not think about him as your playmate in Vrindavana. And such is the kind of love for Krishna that the gopis exhibit, that Udho comes back to Mathura a very humbled man, and he feels that the propounding of this kind of Krishna as consciousness, Krishna as the reality, really holds nothing in front of this very innocent, pure, unabashed, abundant love that the gopis display for Krishna. So, those were some of her works before she went into Meera.
I know. How many compositions do you think she picked? Do you have an approximate idea?
I would say it would run into thousands.
Absolutely.
Really? Absolutely. We have almost about documented, there must be about 700-800 of them. And then there were, pieces which she had sort of tuned and she would sing and then would somewhere feel that maybe this is not the right time to sort of do it in Abhinaya. So maybe we'll save it for a later time. So now what I'm doing is that I'm just sort of delving back into those old diaries, old books, old cassettes in which she has recorded and trying to see. Yeah. So that's like a huge project.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. Anyway, when I came to Delhi in 2019 January for this performance, I had a lovely 3 days with your parents. As we already talked about, of course, the hospitality was over the top, and then of course, like you said, I felt absolutely at home, and we talked about everything under the sun, not just dance.
And what comes back to my mind is when both you and Amma were getting ready for that performance in the evening. It was like old times. You were both putting on makeup together. You were wondering what sari to wear.
And we have to remember that I forgot my whole makeup bag at home in Chennai.
And my mother calling me practically, where's your dance makeup? Ramya needs it. I was like, okay, I'm going to dash in 2 minutes and give it to you. So it was all just so nostalgic. And later on, she would always tell me, she said, this is like the way we used to get ready, like for mommy's programs, Somebody's forgotten a jitki, somebody's forgotten a ballet, and everyone's helping everyone out. So it was just so beautiful. Yeah.
So Ragini, I'm wearing this in memory of your mother who gave it to me when I visited you all in January of 2019. It was really a blessing and very special to share the stage with her. And it ended up being even more significant than I thought it would be.
Yes.
I'm so happy and grateful that you joined me to have this conversation about the work that
the pleasure was all ours.
Your mom Jamuna had done, as well as the work that you're continuing, as well as our relationship and friendship over the many decades.
Yes.
So thank you again.